Hello, welcome back. It is week 166 on Out on the Line podcast. I'm Jeff with my co-host, as always, Alex. How you doing this week?
Jeff, I got my sad boy pants on this week because we are tackling the bad boys of sad boys. We're going to be talking about The Cure. Before we do that, Jeff, I got to know, how you doing?
I'm doing very well. Had myself an adventure today that I was explained to you before the podcast. So golfing turned into battery issues, turned into waiting forever to get that taken care of, turned into getting home and finding out that my dogs don't like going out in the rain, so they deposited some nice little puddles for me here. So it's been a long day, but I am ready to talk about Robert Smith and his band, The Cure. Now, do you know if they are they all original members still? Or
that's a great question. Let's find out.
Let's find out.
I think the guitarist is new, if I understand it.
Okay. I'm wondering if maybe someone like either left or passed away or something. I don't know if Robert Smith is a jerk. I don't think I've ever got that impression.
That's not the impression I get either. Yeah. Main songwriter Robert Smith and drummer Lawrence Tolhurst. Smith has remained the only constant member, though bassist Simon Gallup has been present for all but about 3 years of the band's history. The band's current lineup features Smith and Gallup alongside longtime members. Okay, so I was wrong. Reeves Gabriels is the guy, and he's been playing with them since 2012. All right, so he's the newest one in the mix.
Okay, still been there 12 years.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so to me, The Cure, like obviously Friday I'm in Love, there's a lot of, and I'm gonna blank on more of them. I was just talking about how I know like a handful. I'll know them when I hear them, folks. Like just very much a band of that moment. So in the 80s there was this huge movement. You had your kind of Flock of Seagulls type like new wave sort of thing, and then what would you say The Cure is? Was it like post punk?
I think most people would say, yeah, post-punk. I personally call it dark wave. Dark wave is one of my favorite genres, which makes sense because I'm a total like creepy little weirdo. The hallmarks are like very romantic themes, like all these like big feelings and the loneliness and the alienation that you kind of hear coming up in some of the Cure songs. But also just like it's not bogged down in sadness. It's just kind of thematically big and specific, just like weird, creepy, crazy stuff on the keys and synthesizers, which is one major aspect I'm interested in talking about on this album. But yeah, I guess I would call them dark wave. Post-punk, you could even make an argument for new wave, but I'm gonna say dark wave.
Yeah, I think they might have had some like new wavy elements, but that new wave to me is more like Aha or Flock of Seagulls, Duran Duran. New wave to me is more like that. The Cure is more like, the Jesus and Mary Chain, Depeche Mode. Those are the bands that I really like kind of put them together with. And The Cure is one of my favorite bands from like, because anytime I do those playlists, again, I haven't gone like deep dive into their albums and stuff like that, but of the when you put together these playlists that combine your new wave and your post-punk and your dark wave and all these bands that kind of floated around each other in this time period, The Cure is heavy on that list. And I think they're looked at as one of the like best bands from that era, not necessarily based on like the hits or anything like that, but just as far as the kind of pure art of songwriting, I think The Cure is held in pretty high regard for especially what they did during that era. But I think they've been pretty much producing stuff, or at least Robert Smith has, the whole time, since the 80s when they kind of blew up and became popular. I think there is a huge emotional aspect to The Cure. I think a lot of the bands in the late 90s, these kind of Midwest emo and like punk bands and these kind of post-hardcore bands, a lot of them owe, I think, a little bit of their space to bands like The Cure, and kind of making this really overt like effort to be very emotional in the music, and to a point where, in some of the Cure songs, like, it gets a little bit obsessive. It's much too self-deprecating. It's kind of like masochistic. It's really just a lot of, I think there's an effort to find the sadness rather than finding the happiness a lot of times, but I think it's just like an indulgence in emotion is kind of how I see it. Because if you listen to interviews with Robert Smith, like, he's kind of like, soft spoken and everything. He's not one that's like super happy and excited. He's not going to totally surprise you with his demeanor versus how he writes and sings his songs. But he's not constantly talking about how the world is dark and gray, how his heart is blacker than the longest night. He's not saying that stuff. It's just like, clearly that's what he does in his music. And he's just, in general, seems to be a very like emotive person and like intellectually, like, kind of emotional person.
Yeah, and truth be told, as far as like my exposure to the Cure, it's the basic bitch stuff, right? Boys Don't Cry, Friday, Just Like Heaven.
Mm-hmm.
Very, very like basic stuff. But then after listening to this album and in preparation for this episode, I went back and I listened to a bunch of their other stuff, like beyond the singles, beyond that album. I went and was just like, I'm gonna pick a couple songs. I'll do like little cursory research and pick a couple songs from a couple albums throughout the years just to hear what they're doing. And the two big things I noticed is a lot of their shit sounds different, but it's not a result of chasing a trend. Like, they never in the 90s were like, we're gonna do a grunge album. They never tried to do like a radical reinvention of their sound. And yet, like, album to album, decade to decade, what I learned or found is that everything still managed to sound different and still managed to sound fresh. And to me, the like depressing, angsty aspects of it are kind of minimal compared to some of the other stuff. Like, they're not the way that Robert Smith writes. It's not like Elliott Smith. Like, you listen to an Elliott Smith song and you're just like, I think all of the serotonin in my brain is gone and it's never coming back. I'll never have another happy day, knowing that this kind of pain ever existed on the planet and could again, and it could happen to me. And I don't quite have that existential crisis listening to The Cure. Again, I think early on, as I think about it, I would even say like solidly new wave. Because for me, you talk about new wave, Talking Heads is the gold standard for me. And you can kind of draw, if you squint, a line between Talking Heads and The Cure. The Cure didn't get as far out there, but definitely when they started, you look at something like Boys Don't Cry. That was 1979. And that's got a very like new wave forward sound. And as it went on, it kind of like morphed in the 80s and 90s into the dark wave, where just the sound got a little darker. And I think a lot of them sound like depressing songs, but some of them are like neutral to uplifting. And that was like an interesting thing, because the joke is always like, oh, Robert Smith of The Cure. But I think it's kind of a thing, like, people are fascinated with Danzig in his regular life, where he's the spooky guy and he just carries around. There's a picture of him carrying kitty litter, and it's like people expect him to be some kind of ghoul, and he's just some dude from New Jersey. And I think Robert Smith splits the difference between having a persona that's kind of like a put on, and just being like totally authentically himself. And I think that, to me, like, it's not necessarily the strongest lyric writing. It's pretty on the nose, but that's okay, because all of the music that's happening around it is pretty unique. And again, the trick for me being to sound fresh. So getting into this album, I would be curious comparing it to whatever Cure you're familiar with at this point. What did you detect in this album?
So this reminded me a lot more of a Coheed and Cambria album than it reminded me of what I thought a Cure album would sound like. So one thing right off the bat that I noticed, and I know I always talk about the length of an album. I saw 49 minutes and that it was 9 songs. And is it 9? I feel like
it's 8.
it's 8. Even better to make my point. And I saw that, I was like, "Ooh, these are going to be some doozies." Like a Meatloaf album. It's like there's no song less than 5.5 minutes. You know what I mean? It's you look at that and you're like, okay, well, this is not what I was expecting. Because it's not like the other ones I'm familiar with are just these little tiny short songs. Like they're decent length, 4 minutes long, whatever they are. But I did not expect the Cure album. And I was like, either one of these songs is like 25 minutes long, or all of them are on average like pretty lengthy. And I think the shortest one was, where is it? Drone No Drone, I think, was the one that was like almost 5 minutes long, and that was the shortest on the album. So immediately I knew, I was like, okay, my expectations are probably not correct for this album, because I can't imagine they're writing 8-9 minute songs like they do Friday I'm in Love or Boys Don't Cry, like any of those kind of things. Like I just don't think that I immediately kind of knew that's not what I was going to hear. And what I ended up hearing was something that very consistently throughout the album is you get these big intros, which were musically great. I feel like Robert Smith has got to be like a studio rat, or maybe they all are, or something, because it just seemed like the production value, there's a lot of attention paid to creating layers and kind of trying to take you to different places throughout the song. So to me, this was much closer to an effort like Rush or Coheed would make towards writing a song than I would expect The Cure to be doing. There was a lot of these songs where I found, kind of maybe halfway through the album, you kind of realize like everything is sounding a little bit samey throughout this album. Like the structure of the songs seemed very similar, and that kind of continued throughout the whole album as well. But at no point did I find myself being like, oh, I wish that wasn't the case. It was very strange that they could put an album together like that. Maybe because I knew I was going into it like, it's The Cure, so at least it's going to be like the effort is going to be there, and that this sound is going to be there, the production value is going to be there. So maybe you're going in, maybe they're kind of a step ahead going into this thing. But it was not what I was expecting to hear. And while I would love to hear an album full of songs like Friday I'm in Love or Boys Don't Cry or Just Like Heaven, I'm glad that this is the album that I got, because it was so surprising to me that it was so far from my expectation.
You definitely can't deny the effort that went into it. I would say to mixed results when it comes to the way some of the pieces came together. So it's not necessarily that the songwriting itself is the problem, or that there's a wrong answer somewhere with a chord progression or a musical thought. It's just some of the production and some of the mixing and some of the choices on this kind of stuck out to me, and it's probably nitpicks, but they're interesting nitpicks to me in the larger context of The Cure, because going back through this music, one of the most consistent things I've seen is the sound of the drums, the relationship the drums and the bass have. They are these very crispy, cold, stark, like when he hits the snare, it's just it's not like a big full sound. It's like a flat, aggressive, dry sound. So the drum kit is dry as a bone, and the bass is like super duper lush, and the drum is kind of providing structure so that the bass can provide some of the richness. So I think like that's a cool recurring feature of their rhythm section that I really appreciated.
Mm-hmm.
But then that crispy sound kind of sort of gets abandoned here. Um, and it winds up clashing really hard for me with the synth. And I am a synth snob. I'm very picky. Synth, organ, and keys, it's like very easy to make them sound canned and make them. I get by its definition that synth is a synthesizer and it is synthesized. It's not a physical instrument per se, but the real trick is to make it sound like it is. Like it's
Mm-hmm.
something you can pick up and play like a little fiddle. It's a real trick to make those things sound like not sound like they came out of a can. And on this, unfortunately, the synth and the keys really did sound pretty canned as a result of the production. I was actually kind of shocked because The Cure, from everything I listened to, always did synth really, really, really well. It's such an integral part of new wave and especially dark wave. And they really nailed it in the dark wave stuff. And it sounded beautiful and dark and three-dimensional and real. And for some reason, that didn't come together on this album. I also think when you're talking about like building layer upon layer, it's true in a sense, except like I'm a patient man. I'm a Beach House fan. The difference is Beach House will ride an 8-minute song that like starts with one element, adds a billion of them, never stops. And this kind of felt like the same couple layers we start with. They don't get added. There's really kind of nowhere to go. And it becomes a little bit repetitive. And it made some of the intros feel interminably long. And you talk about that midpoint. I felt the same way where we got to the middle of the album. I was like, none of this is bad. This is all chugging along, but it all does sound kind of the same. But around the midpoint, the album starts to pick up a little bit. I had a question for you. What was it? Well, I guess I'd like to hear your thoughts on what I said about production and synth and stuff.
So to me, I think once I got into the idea that these were going to be kind of long haul songs, like those are kind of my bread and butter, is songs like that, you know? So like, I really love Meatloaf. I always talk about Coheed and Cambria. I love Rush. You know, I love these bands that make these epically long songs, like Death Cab's done a couple of them that are fantastic. You know, I think what I would compare this to is like I Will Possess Your Heart by Death Cab, like the album version of that song, where it has that bass line that just goes and goes and goes and goes. And so I liked it at first, and then I kind of soured on it because I was like, man, this goes forever. And I just switch and listen to the radio version because I like the rest of the song. I think that was something that can happen to people on this album. You know, I think with a lot of these intros, if that's not the type of song that you like to listen to, like if you don't go out of your way to listen to some prog rock or some, you know, something like that, you're probably not going to be into this unless you're a huge Cure fan and you just love hearing anything that they do, because Robert Smith sounded exactly like he did 40 years ago. I mean, just like insane that his voice has stayed this way, or maybe it's studio work. I don't know. But I felt like this was, you could have just taken like 1985 Robert Smith and put him in this, and you wouldn't really tell the difference in the voices. Like that's one thing, is he's kept it strong with the voice. Like, you know, that's a Cure song because of exactly how he like forms those vowels sometimes. And what I liked, I guess because I didn't go back and listen to as much as you did, I probably picked another like handful of songs that I kind of breezed through, but not like a deep dive at all. And I guess I could hear like everything seemed a little shinier and all that. But I think kind of the point of this one was to give it almost like an apocalyptic sort of feel, like a very dystopian sort of feel on this one, you know. And I think like the, you know, album title Songs of a Lost World, I don't know if he's literally talking about a world, but I think he's talking about a, like just something, you know, like songs of a lost anything, like whatever's in you know, in your life that's important to you. If you lose it, you know, I think the idea was to make this feel very dark and heavy and like foreboding. And, you know, I think that was the emotion that it was trying to get across. So I don't think I really listened for differences in the production value. So if there was a big difference in like the drums and the bass and like kind of how they interacted in their previous work versus now, you know, I'm sure there's some Cure fans that are going to listen to this and they can, you know, tell us, like, if you're one that's been, you know, listening to the Cure a bunch and you obviously know more about them than I do, let us know, like, if that's truly a thing, because I think if it was not intentional, it's a problem. You know, if it's intentional, then it's just a matter of taste, I think, really, if you like it or not. For me, I think it happened to be that it's something that I liked, but I think on your side where you go that deep into it, I'm sure you heard like every version of The Cure. And this one may or may not be something that people are saying like, oh, they may not think this is a good Cure album at all. I'd be interested to hear what people that are like longtime fans of them would say.
Yeah, I would be too. And I one thing along my travels that I kind of gleaned is that Cure people are pretty loyal and passionate, and not in like the Beehive way where like, I'm gonna fucking kill you. You didn't know how many original members were in the fucking band. Like, but they seem like pretty genuine and pretty passionate, and they're pretty moved by the stuff. And from the looks of it, Cure fans are into this album. And to be clear, I'm being critical of it in a weird way just because there was so much to get excited about on their previous releases. This, you can't say that it's like bad or aggression. It's just like there were some kind of baffling choices. Like, I think opting for the big, like you say apocalyptic, and I'm like, yeah, I kind of see that, but apocalyptic in a very like theatrical, stagey way, like Hamlet staged in the wasteland, like college production. Like, I can see that kind of like depiction of the lost world, the wasteland. Not necessarily literally, but the sound conjures up images. And like, that book that I'm always referencing, This Is What It Sounds Like. Some people, when they hear a song, like they always generate imagery. Some people don't. I feel like a lot of people do the imagery, certainly where my mind goes. So it's got a like very big theatrical, orchestral sound, but the trade-off is you lose all of that like gothic minimalism that they had, that they were like, I think that's what a lot of people associate The Cure with, 80s, 90s. So you're kind of trading that weirdness and that minimalism and that sound for something that's like kind of far bigger than any other Cure songs I really heard. And somewhere in that you lose the intimacy. And it's weird to say like you can have something that doesn't feel intimate, but it's very lonely. But that's kind of how it feels, is like there's an emptiness, there's a loneliness. It's not necessarily bad. It's just not what I enjoyed as much listening to the other stuff. That being said, for this being the first time they stepped out in like 16 years or some shit, pretty damn good. These are not guys that feel like they have something to prove. You can tell. It's very earnest. It's not playing to trends. It's not convincing anyone of their relevance or vitality or anything like that. It's very honest. Robert Smith, for me, maybe more than any other element, like you said, the voice is synonymous with that sound. And that's still here. He hasn't missed a step. So it's not like, oh, this was a horrendous miscalculation on the part of The Cure. I can't claim the right to being like a Cure expert and a huge Cure fan, because I really just kind of did my deep dive since we decided to do this album. I'm not the Cure guy. I can't like make that judgment. And I didn't not enjoy this. My first listen through, I struggled a little bit. And then when you kind of know what's coming and you can go back, you let go, you revisit these. It's like when you see a movie, after that tension is broken, you can watch it again and pick up the details. Very much the kind of listen this was for me on this one. So not every choice, for me, it really does come down to the production. It's got a weird, like muddy sound that isn't like that dynamic. It kind of steps on a lot of stuff, which is very weird. But I think the songwriting, the Cure sound, the authenticity, it stays pretty on the nose and pretty plain. You get a song like I Can Never Say Goodbye, which was written for Robert Smith's brother who passed away. That just feels like a very earnest, connected piece of songwriting. So there's nothing to fault there. It really just, for me, kind of comes on the back end with the way some of the instruments sound as a result of weird synth choices and weird production to it. It was just a little muddy for me.
I think that's fair. If you're, I think when you compare it to their previous work, it's definitely, as we sit here and I think of those kind of melody lines from the songs that we mentioned, that they did in the past, like it was very simple. It's like you have a very distinctive like kind of guitar lick that they're doing. And then I can hear that bass and that drum, and like I can hear what you're saying with how that bass, the drum sounds, the way it does. The bass has that very like is very forward in kind of the, it's not just going along with the beat. It's not providing just the rhythm. It's providing its own melody as well. I think they're, for me on this album, I think it's going to end up being a stream it. I think it's the kind of thing with like, remember like Casey Musgrave's Starcrossed? It was way different than anything else she'd done previously. And her fans that were already fans like loved that album. But outside of that, it did not do very well. And I think that's the sort of situation that we're gonna get here. Like I don't see any of these songs being radio hits. You know what I mean? I don't think these are taking the place on those classic rock stations of their other work. But for me, it's going to be a pretty solid stream it. I think if you like prog rock, you're going to probably find something to like here. If you already like The Cure, you've probably already heard it. But yeah, stream it for me.
It's going to get a hearty stream it from me as well. I think it holds its own against again a lot of the other shit I listen to. I didn't necessarily go every single album in order, every single song. I did a little bit of research. I listened to the ones that, like, let's face it, people on Reddit were like, oh, the Cure fandom seems to be in agreement that this is a really good one to listen to. So having listened to all that and put that all together, this fits snugly within the canon. And I think it's a solid, to quote Matt Reno, this album is rock solid. I think what kept it from being more of a really special thing to me, like if you had taken the themes and the things that are being sung about in this and kind of found a way to merge the orchestral elements with that minimalism and that intimacy, there was a way to play it off where you find a way to incorporate the synth without making it sound fake, making it sound part of the orchestra. You keep the orchestra very like balletic and intimate, as opposed to this kind of like big chamber sound. That for me, I think with all the other elements, like you don't need scorching guitar solos. That's not the Cure. It's fairly simplistic. It's what they do with all the pieces in the toolbox. So that production choice notwithstanding, I think this is rock solid. That I think is the one thing that keeps me from reaching potential buy it status. But I would say hell of an effort, super cool that they're this consistent. They're still making music. Again, the Cure fans are going batty. So it's maybe not all the way entirely my thing, but I respect the effort and stream it.
Excellent. Well, if there's other episodes that people wanted to check out, Alex, like of this show, where do you think they might find that sort of thing?
Oh, of this show? This one right here?
This very one.
This podcast that we're doing right now, Out on That Line. I don't want to be telling tales out of school, Jeff. But if I had to make an educated guess as to where the people could find this and other shit like this, it would probably be a safe bet to say youtube.com/C/Out on That Line. Folks, here we are again. Okay. We always seem to find ourselves in this bucket of syrup, in this pickle where you don't get what I'm putting down, and I'm making an urgent appeal to your sense of decency. You have to subscribe, turn your notifications on so that when we drop new stuff, you're the first to hear about it before anyone else. It's goddamn special. You got to like the videos, okay? Motivation to go on. Sometimes I look at our likes to dislikes ratio and we're rocking a steady BAC of 100% satisfaction. Other times I go, oh my God, 47% of people, like we have a 47% approval rating on this video. My self-esteem is in tatters. So it would mean a lot to us if you would also leave comments. You can call us huge losers. You can disagree with our take on The Cure. You can pretty much say whatever you want within the guidelines of good taste and polite society in the comments. What's important is just that you comment at youtube.com/C/out on that line.
That was extremely well done, because I sprung that on you. I know you weren't expecting to have to do that.
You know, sometimes you got your dancing shoes on and someone says, do the Macarena, and you say, why the hell not?
Well, if you want to see Alex do the Macarena, do what he said. Go to youtube.com/C/out on that line. Until next time.